tonight. This is such amazing turnout. This is the inaugural Abramson Art Artist lecture. So thank you so much. I know a lot of familiar faces, and I've introduced myself to the rest of you, but I'm Melissa Sullivan. I'm the brand new publisher for Neshaminy, and as you know, Neshaminy is our literary and historical magazine. It's a co-production of the Doylestown Historical Society and the Bucks County Writers Workshop. And Doylestown Historical Society, sorry, excuse me, I'm very overwhelmed by how many people have come tonight, so I'm just so excited, sorry. So they are preserving and celebrating the creative and historic nature of Doylestown and surrounding areas. They work with donation or members. We have some information, some sign-ups for you up here. And Donna, where's Donna? Donna, the executive director, who has been a big part of putting this together. She's available to answer any questions you might have about volunteering or becoming a member. And as I mentioned, we also have the Bucks County Writers Workshop. They are the workshop we're celebrating our 25th year this year of being around, and they work with writers with the goal of getting them published. And we have Don here, who is the founder of both Neshaminy and the workshop. So if you have any questions about becoming a writer in the Bucks County area, Don is the person to talk to. And of course, a big thank you to all of our support staff. We've got Sherry over here on box. Yeah, we got Sherry. We got Nina on chairs over there. We got Tom on camera, and we also have Donna and Joanne as well, who's playing tambourine. And Pat, oh yeah, we got Pat. Like we've got so many great people here tonight. So as I said, this is our first lecture. We named it after Stuart Abramson, who's here tonight. Hey, Stu. Stu is the former publisher of Neshaminy. He was the co-founder with Don back in 2019. He's also he was a president here of DHS for how many years now?
9 years.
9 years he was a president here. He's also a naval officer before that. So a quote from General MacArthur comes to mind: "Old soldiers never die." So Stu is never getting rid of us. He will always be part of the Neshaminy family. And we're just really happy to name this series Arts and Artists after Stu, and with the idea of presenting local artists and historians for years to come. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about our speakers tonight. So we have Daniel Dorian. Now, Daniel has had the most interesting life I think I've ever heard of. He was an actor, a radio DJ, he's been a foreign correspondent, and a film producer, and I swear to God he's going to have something exciting next. He's just one of those guys.
Oh, please.
He is speaking about book banning and censorship from a historical perspective, and unfortunately for Bucks County, a current perspective as well. And then we also have Professor Tom Sparrow, who is here. He's a professor of philosophy from Slippery Rock University, and he has done research into Henry Mercer. And we all think of him as, you know, an archaeologist, a tile designer, but he also tried to write fiction. So I think what we can take away from that, Don, is that everyone secretly wants to be a writer. I think that's the goal there. So he's going to talk about his research, about his stories, some dastardly folks in publishing that Mercer got involved with, and why we might not be seeing reprints of those stories these days, right? Okay, so I think with that, thank you again so much for coming, and we're going to get started. So Danielle, do you want to come up? Thank you.
I think before I begin, I want to express my thanks to Don Swain. Without his love for the writing word, Neshaminy and the Bucks County Writers Workshop would not exist. Augustus, also known as Octavian, the founder of the Roman Empire, banished Ovid's treatise about the art of love, Ars Amatoria, for being too graphic. In 36 AD, Caligula, the Roman emperor, tried to ban Homer's Odyssey for being too liberal in expressing Greek ideals of freedom. More than 2,000 years later, between 1990 and the year 2000, Adult titles of books authored by established writers in America have been the object of more than 6,300 complaints, resulting in the censorship of many, many books, among them 8 by Nora Roberts, one of the most popular authors in America. Books that were banned from school libraries in Florida for containing inappropriate material. In 1798, the US Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts that not only made it a crime for American citizens to print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing about the government, but also demonized non-citizens, making it easier to arrest and deport them. 225 years later, in 2022, more than 2,500 book bans occurred in 138 school districts in 32 states. The same Florida county that banned Nora Roberts' books pulled 20 books by best-selling author Jodi Picoult from school libraries. Approximately 40 million copies of her books are in print worldwide. In 1873, the Federal Anti-Obscenity Act waged a crusade aimed at seeking out and destroying all obscene literature. 150 years later, at last count, 44 states have started debating whether to introduce bills that would limit what schools can teach about race, American history, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Efforts are underway to remove from school libraries books on slavery and race. While we went from the horse cart to supersonic travel in less than 200 years, it seems that we have regressed and gone back centuries in certain cultural and social areas. History has a tendency to repeat itself, doesn't it? When asked recently why I chose to write an article on book banning, I answered by saying that book banning was a major issue with far-reaching consequences. An issue that will define the era in which we live, much as the Inquisition has in the Middle Ages. Simply put, I see book banning as an attack on free speech. I see book banning as an attack on individual freedom. As a former journalist, I could not pass the opportunity Neshaminy offered me to write about it. Added to my journalistic interest for that particular topic was my bewilderment. How could such a scourge ever come to pass in modern America, the land of the free, the land of free speech? That it could happen in Florida was less of a surprise. After all, Florida is extremely conservative. But in Pennsylvania, in Bucks County, of all places, what is more baffling is that this push to censor books nationwide is not backed by the majority of people. A poll found that over 70% of parents oppose book banning. Yet, the bans continue. Many public school districts find themselves in a bind. They face threats and political pressure, along with parental fears and anxieties surrounding the books on their school shelves. Even more libraries, especially school libraries, writes the author Emily St. James in a recent New York Times editorial, are facing what journalist Kelly Jensen has called quiet censorship, in which books are not entirely banished, but removed from display, available only to those who know to ask. And in the case of minor, to those who have parental permission. School boards, administrators, teachers, and librarians are told in some cases to, in quote, err in the side of caution in the books they make available. And too often, that's exactly what they do. Only a few impose their ideology on us all. A small group of really strong-voiced people can make a lot of people very miserable, says Janet McMahon, the former director of the library in Vinton, Iowa. Only a few mistrust the ability of our school librarians, who are highly qualified professionals, to simply do their jobs. Let's take as an example Nora Roberts' 8 books chosen to be banned from school libraries in Florida. The objection for these books was submitted to by a single woman, who was the leader of the local Moms for Liberty chapter, a group that has 250 chapters nationwide and that claims it is fighting to protect children from pornography in school. I always wondered why this group could possibly call itself Moms for Liberty. Liberty, when its main purpose is to suppress or restrict the freedom to read? Meanwhile, this action by a few has already had devastating consequences. The American Libraries Association says a record 2,571 books were challenged to censorship in 2022, an increase of over 1,100% in just 2 years. Our own neighborhood has not escaped this censorship tsunami. Most public schools in Bucks County, particularly Central Bucks East and Central Bucks West, have succumbed to this sanitization. Bucks County's conservative majority school board has enacted a new library policy that is nothing less than pure censorship, and that was staunchly opposed by parents, employees, and students. Policy 109.2 bars elementary and middle school libraries from shelving books that contain, quote, visual or visually implied depictions of sexual acts, or visual depictions of nudity or implied nudity, vague terms that often open the door to frivolous objections. Maybe the angry politicians and activists who are at the source of this movement don't fully realize that their action will have grave repercussions on our society and on our economy. Ronald Reagan, yes, our conservative ex-president Ronald Reagan, once said, "So long as books are kept open, then minds can never be closed." To close them, to ban inputs of knowledge that have been identified as potentially causing psychological distress, says David Lehan, the president of Ponce Health Sciences University, will reduce the ability of young people to engage in strategic analysis. It will deprive them of the skills that are needed to cite arguments, demonstrable facts, and empirical evidence to validate their points of view. Such learning curves will create homogeneous and faulty conclusions that will lead to bad decisions in every profession. The byproduct of this educational narrowing, he adds, will be millions of young adults who will be unable to function, collaborate, and prosper in college and in the working world. In an age dominated by algorithms, going to a good library feels a little like replenishing your brain with the variety of all that is available to you in the world, writes Emily James. No more with book banning. Book bans can create a culture of fear in society, says Emily Knox, National Coalition Against Censorship Board President. They really, really tear the community apart. Vamsi Jewelry, a professor of media and Asian studies at the University of San Francisco, worries, if books are banned in schools, students will go without important cultural education. If a book is banned or suppressed, he says, they're not even going to realize that something very important is being excluded of them. What these people say in simple terms is that book banning would eventually create a generation of morons incapable of thinking for themselves. Will this eagerness to censure persist, increase? Will it spread like a cancer? Or will it simply be a passing trend? If we judge from history, most societies that have suffered under the yoke of religious fanaticism or of political extremism have eventually freed themselves from these restraints. Our pilgrims, for instance, did not escape the scourge of fanatical censorship, yet they set up the foundations of a free world governed by a constitution that guarantees free speech. I would like to believe that book banning is indeed a passing trend, that the nation will not remain divided forever, that the action of a few will not continue to impact the lives of us all, that eventually reason and sanity will prevail. The public really doesn't like book bannings, says Jeremy Young, professor of political science at Brigham University. So, if the majority opposes book banning, as this professor implies, I strongly believe it will defeat it eventually. Now, before I close, I'd like to share a bit of information that my wife last night found out online. According to the Smithsonian Magazine, readers can now access books banned in their area for free with a new app. All you have to do is first visit thebannedbookclub.info, in one word, thebannedbookclub.info, so to see the list of books that are banned. Then you can download these books for free using Palace e-reader app. Palace e-reader. And you can read the books that are banned. And actually, I really feel that banning books will favor the sale of these books in any case. Thank you.
Thank you. If I don't say this now, I'll forget. I want to thank Melissa and Don and Bill and Neshaminy and the Historical Society for making this happen. And thank you all for coming out to hear me talk about Mercer's fiction. Can you hear me okay here? Because I might have to move because I cheated. I put some of my notes up on the slides and I need to see them there because I can't see them on my tiny computer. The short story on this particular story is I became a few years ago interested in Mercer's fiction, namely his book November Night Tales, which was published in 1928. I looked up online, as everybody does, tried to figure out more information about how this book got published, and I really couldn't find the story of how this guy, who's known for publishing mostly nonfiction about archaeology or anthropology and history and other sorts of related fields, came to publish a book of fiction. Before I start, could I ask, has anybody read Mercer's stories? Okay, just a few people. That's good. I was assuming that most people haven't. So I visited Fonthill in 2019 with my family, and I had a lovely tour guide named Marcy, and I was already interested in the architecture. Marcy mentioned that Mercer had published some stories that had a kind of Gothic flavor, and as a lover of Gothic fiction myself, I was immediately intrigued about how this came about, because he wasn't known as a literary figure. And so I was wondering, how did this guy come to publish a book, which is often very hard to do, as a lot of writers know. I will say one disclaimer: I am not a historian. I'm not even an amateur historian, or maybe I would be a crummy historian because I'm awful with dates. I can't remember dates. I'm a philosopher by training, but I am an avid lover of architecture, of the Gothic, of mysteries and detective fiction, and I really saw this endeavor as a kind of work of a bit of detective work. And so in 2020, kind of in the middle of the pandemic, I was able, for a brief period in the summer when everybody thought it was going to end, to visit the Mercer Museum and spend a few days in the archive with my mask on, very limited capacity there at the time. And I spent some time looking at mostly the letters and other documents associated with the publication history of this book, November Night Tales. And so I just wanted to share that story of how this book came to be published. I originally published an essay in this independent British journal called Wormwood, which is attached to a small publisher of weird fiction in the UK, which is now defunct, the journal, as of this year. And so I reached out to Neshaminy and Don, and they happily took on my essay and reprinted it right here in the heart of Bucks County, where I figured there would be some people who are interested in Henry Mercer. The reason I published in Wormwood is because it's the only place where I actually found an essay on Henry Mercer's fiction. So I figured I would write a follow-up piece that told the publication history. There's actually very little written about Mercer's fiction, and so I had some work to do. All right. It wasn't until 1928, November 22nd precisely, that he actually had his book of short stories printed. And it only went through one printing, and it wasn't until 2015 that November Night Tales was reprinted. It was actually picked up by two different presses independently of one another. The first, Valancourt Books, which is housed in Richmond, Virginia. The other one is Swan River Press, which is housed in Dublin, Ireland. Both of them reprinted Mercer's collection of stories here. This one contains an introduction by Peter Bell, who also wrote an essay for Wormwood on Mercer's fiction. The introduction to this edition was penned by Corey Amsler of the Mercer Museum. What else do we want to say here? Yeah, they're mostly stories. I mean, they're generally kind of Gothic tales, although Mercer, as I'll say a couple of times throughout the presentation, regarded them as sort of adventure stories. He was a big fan of Robert Louis Stevenson and Arthur Conan Doyle in particular, and so and he had a very, and again I'll repeat this, he had a kind of Victorian sensibility, and he kind of fancied himself writing in that particular mode. I pulled a quote from Peter Bell's essay from Wormwood that I think really kind of summarizes the character of his stories. Bell says that they're pleasingly eclectic. The stories nevertheless share a unified vision, an authorial voice that draws skillfully on Mercer's lifelong erudition and his fascination with the strangeness of a world wherein reality is no more than a shade in a disquieting spectrum of uncertainty. All right, I thought that really summarized the collection here. The original book here contained 6 stories. The new editions have 7. There was a 7th story found among Mercer's papers, and it's printed in the new editions, but the original edition only contained 6 stories. I underlined 2 of them because they have castle in the title, which it was not surprising. Some of the other stories that don't have castle in the title do include castles. And so anybody who knows Mercer obviously knows of his fascination with castles. There are 6 stories. I've given a little summary here. I'm not going to read all of this here, but the first story, which is also printed in the new edition of Neshaminy, Castle Valley, takes place right here in Highborough. This is Doylestown. The story is set in a town called Highborough, which seems obvious to be Doylestown. And it also, part of it takes place, or much of it takes place, in a place that he calls Castle Valley. Google Maps tells me that just southwest of here there is a Castle Valley Park, which is along the Neshaminy river, and he mentions that Castle Valley is along, he calls it a stream, but I'm pretty sure we know where he's talking about here. This is an atmospheric tale that involves magic crystals and visions of castles and hypnotism of a certain kind. A moral dilemma where the protagonist is trying to decide if he should become a politician or an architect. You know what he chooses. And so you can read that story right here in Neshaminy. Some of the other stories involve tales, dark fantasies involving mad scientists, resurrectionists, digging up bodies and having vultures feed on them to clear the flesh from the bones. There's a haunted a haunted house story called the Doll's Castle, which is based on an apparently real haunted house on Bainbridge Street in Philadelphia that Mercer learned about through one of his friends. So there's a story called The Wolf Book that is a kind of antiquarian adventure, search for a ancient manuscript that involves a houseboat journey down an Eastern European river that may very well have been inspired by Mercer's trip down the Danube on a houseboat with his friends and his manservant. Like I said, he really fancied his stories to be kind of adventure stories, even though there's something strange or macabre or gothic about each one of them. You see that the stories really kind of incorporate some of his scholarship or his scholarly background, which is why they're often kind of compared with the stories of M.R. James. If you don't know M.R. James, he's many consider James the kind of master ghost story writer of England. His book Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, published in 1904, contains a number of tales that involve ghosts or demons or other sorts of kind of terrifying kind of incidents, which Mercer stories themselves don't really have a kind of terror to them, I wouldn't say. Like I said, they lean more towards the adventure side of things. And so, but they often involve a kind of antiquarian protagonist or some sort of pursuit of antiquarian artifacts. And so I think that's what often leads to the comparison with James himself. You can see on the right there a little stack that I had the folks at the Mercer Museum pull from Fonthill for me. You can see that Mercer had a copy of M.R. James's Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. What I find really curious about his marginalia in there, not only his sort of critical comments, he wasn't a big fan of James. He thought his stories were a little bit too scholarly, a little too academic for his taste. I think he describes them at one point as reading as reports from the Society of Psychical Research, which is a England-based paranormal society. But what I found most curious about his marginalia was that you could see in his copy of James's book there, Mercer sort of counting the words in each of the stories to try and figure out how long a normal short story should be. That was one of my most exciting finds. As I said, he was a big fan of Arthur Conan Doyle. That book, the second one from the top, Round the Fire Stories, he was particularly fond of. In particular, a story called The Beetle Hunter, which I won't spoil it for you, but a man responds to a newspaper advertisement looking for someone who is in the medical profession, of a resolute nature, physically fit, and knows something about beetles. This really intrigued Mercer. This little quote from a kind of reflective piece from Mercer, An Incident in My Life, I think really sums up the impetus for Mercer's, I guess his impetus for writing his stories, but also tells us a lot about, I guess, his imagination, right, and his kind of attachment to adventure. He says, I often thought of mysterious amulets and murderous tomahawks buried, no one knows where, and could fancy myself in the act of unearthing the sacred bones and war paraphernalia of some renowned sachem, many perhaps, right? So he had this kind of this curiosity, this imagination that really, I think, I don't know how to put it. Gave him a sort of a love of adventure, and he kind of assumed that if you went out into the world, you could find something or run into something curious or uncover something curious. All right, so I visited Fonthill in 2019. He's got all these books. There's a skull on the mantelpiece. I'm intrigued already. His house, even though it's not kind of, I'm not an architectural historian or an architect, but I don't think it's properly a Gothic kind of sort of structure, but it has a kind of darkness to it. I don't know about your experience of Fonthill, but it has a darkness to it, which intrigued me immediately. I got a hold of the spreadsheet of his library holdings, or the Library of Fonthill, and I found in there that there were books on shipwrecks, the occult, ghost hunting, witches, werewolves, spiritualism. He had books by famous weird fiction authors like Algernon Blackwood, M.R. James, Horace Walpole, Lord Dunsany, Charles Maturin, and I'm thinking this guy has a Gothic imagination that runs through his architectural interests as well as, and I was curious to see if it ran through as well his literary interest, and his library betrays that kind of Gothic sensibility. I wrote to Corey Amsler at one point. He sent me to see if he had anything about Mercer's fiction. He sent me an essay by Joseph Sanford, who was a young friend of Mercer's, also as Amsler put it, his thumbnail biographer. And I think, and Sanford does an excellent job kind of linking up Fonthill with Mercer's literary interests, particularly in November Night Tales. Sanford says, and this was an essay published in The Historian from the Bucks County Historical Society in 1963. Sanford says, the plan of the whole house, Fonthill, actually this is Mercer quoted in Sanford's essay, the plan of the whole house was in interweaving of my own fancies, blending into memories of my travels. And then Sanford says, November Night Tales were these fancies and memories in literary form and were, in measure, autobiographical. Right. Many of the stories, or if not all the stories, have an autobiographical element or elements to them. And I think taken together with Fonthill, we really see that Mercer has this sort of interest in the Gothic, not only architecturally, but literarily as well. And that's the thing that really kind of drew me into this particular project. Just really quickly, the fact that he had an interest in architect and wasn't a bit of an architect himself, that's kind of an understatement, and that he wrote literature of a Gothic nature puts him in company with a number of other famous architects who also wrote Gothic fiction. Ralph Adams Cram, who you can see up there in the top left, who was responsible for the Princeton University Chapel and other structures of so-called the collegiate Gothic. T.G. Jackson, a British architect responsible for the Hartford Bridge at the University of Oxford, sometimes called the Bridge of Sighs. Down here on the left, William Beckford. This is his Fonthill Abbey. I've seen some people say that Fonthill here in Doylestown was named after Fonthill Abbey. In something I came across in the archive, it seemed to be suggested, yeah.
Is there any reason why Ralph Adams Cram dates of 1863 to 1842 backwards? It was backwards?
He died 21 years ago. That's a mistake. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'll get you those dates later. Yeah. He was involved in some paranormal events. Yeah.
It came back later.
Exactly. Yeah. My apologies. Yeah. And then Horace Walpole, often cited as the first Gothic novelist. His Castle of Otranto, published in 1784, I want to say. and his Strawberry Hill house is right there. So Mercer belongs to this collection of.
Where is the Strawberry Hill house?
It's just outside of London in Twickenham, it's called. Twickenham, yeah. That's still available for tours. Okay, so finally, so in 1922, Mercer decides he wants to try and publish his fiction. At the time, he only has one story published, or excuse me, one story written. I'll come back to that in a second. He reaches out to his friend, Harrison S. Morris, who was editor at Lippincott's magazine. He was an art editor at the Ladies' Home Journal, managing director at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and president of the Wharton Steel Company. He was also a writer himself. He wrote poetry, prose, biography, including a biography of Walt Whitman. Importantly for Mercer, he had connections to Penn Publishing and the Century magazine. So he acted as a kind of liaison between Mercer and Penn Publishing, namely Charles Shoemaker there, and L. Frank Tucker at the Century magazine. This is the first, he's the first person to warn Mercer that there's not really a market for short story collections, that if he wants to publish short stories, he'd be better off seeking some sort of popular magazine like the Saturday Evening Post, or a similar kind of magazine that Mercer described as the lurid magazines. He's extremely reticent about publishing in these kind of venues because he's worried that it will undermine his sort of literary credibility. He has a lot of critical remarks to say about these sorts of publications. Harrison Morris tells him this in 1922. Mercer registers that warning but doesn't heed it ever. And we'll get to that in a second there. This is a portrait of Harrison Morris by Thomas Akins. I should say, maybe I'll say now. So there are a number of forces working against Mercer in his journey to publish his fiction. One was that the market wasn't necessarily looking for his kind of fiction, the kind of Gothic-oriented fiction. He was averse to publishing in the popular magazines that would be a kind of suitable market for short stories. And he was, as I said, extremely averse to sort of conforming his sensibility to what he saw as the modern sensibility that had emerged in the literary market in the 1920s, which he was very much opposed to. I'll come back to that in a second as well. In 1922, he actually only had one story called The Sunken City that had been lying around for, what is that, quick math? He wrote it in 1889, so yeah, 33 years it was sitting around. He really wanted, it was a very long short story, which he hoped to publish as a novelette. So he wouldn't have to publish the story in a periodical. He hoped to publish it as a standalone volume, but it was perhaps not long enough to be published as a novelette. He wrote the story at Albury House in Surrey in England in 1889. When Harrison Morris suggested that he write a number of other stories to go along with the one that he had, he did so. And between 22 and 24, he wrote 4 more stories. So by 24, he had a collection of 5 stories, not the final 6 that ultimately made up November Night Tales, but he churned out 4 more stories in just a couple of years. His friend Morris really likes, in particular, the stories Castle Valley and the North Ferry Bridge. He compares him to Edgar Allan Poe and Ambrose Bierce, and is really encouraging to Mercer from a literary perspective, but discouraging insofar as Mercer wants to avoid the popular periodicals, right? So in 1925, a few years later, so he reaches out to a friend that he knows through the antiquarian, his kind of antiquarian network, a man named George F. Dow. was a Boston antiquarian and an author himself. He's an important contributor to the American Antiquarian Society. He's responsible for the design of the Pioneer Village in Salem, Massachusetts. And importantly, he's associated or attached to the Wayside Press of Topsfield, Massachusetts. Turns out there are two Wayside presses in Massachusetts at the time. This is the one in Topsfield. Dow is a really important figure, I find out, because he acts not only as a reader of Mercer's stories, but as his editor, as an advisor, and importantly, as a liaison to other publishers. Dow actually sends out Mercer's manuscript to some publishers on his behalf. He sends November Night Tales to Little Brown and Houghton Mifflin. Both of them reject the collection. Dow, importantly, once again reiterates Harrison Morris's warning that if Mercer wants to publish short stories, he's going to have to do it in the periodicals because publishers don't want collections of short stories, right? Mercer sends some of his, one or two of his stories off to some important literary periodicals, the Cornhill magazine and Century magazine. He gets rejected from both of them in 1926. Dow kind of he's a little firmer with Mercer in the letters that I consulted than Morris was. He's sympathetic about the magazines. He does agree that Mercer doesn't really want to publish in the Saturday Evening Post, but he also thinks that Mercer's going to have to give a little bit if he wants to have his stuff published. He's a little bit more critical of the stories than Morris was as well. He also importantly recommends that Mercer consider getting an agent. He recommends an agent in New York City called Brandt and Brandt, and he advises him to send his query to the literary agent on letterhead so they know who he is. So that they know that he's, quote, not a destitute scribbler looking for a market. Right? It's not until 1928 that Mercer actually seeks out an agent. Yeah. Mercer knows that his writing and his sensibility is old-fashioned. He's self-aware. He knows that he has a Victorian literary sensibility and a modern literary market. But he holds out hope and expresses his hope in his letters that there are plenty of people with a similar sensibility still out there who are looking for his kind of adventure stories. He eventually sends November Night Tales to Penn Publishing via Harrison Morris after he fails at a number of other publishers. Again, he's told time and time again that the short stories are only popular in magazines, not as standalone books. He's frustrated at the modern sensibility. He thinks it's too psychological. Everything happens in the mind in modern short stories. They're too artificial. They're too journalistic. And he's really kind of seething in the letters and at points to his friends about this new modern sensibility that's not receptive to his Victorian stories here. I pulled this document, which if you can't read it, it says names for modern short stories. It's a kind of satirical list that he wrote up for potential short stories that you would find in the market. So you see things on there like aesthetic booze, sophisticated projections of mental states, sophisticated thrill analysis, thrills for thrill's sake, right? The lure of the thrill. So, he's venting his frustration in this document and imagining, what he might title one of his own short stories had they been modern. He laments the loss of the Victorian not only short story sensibility, but also the kind of Victorian critical sensibility. Writers like Emerson and Carlyle and Matthew Arnold and John Ruskin have been replaced with journalists in his mind. Nobody writes serious literary criticism any longer in his view. And in a document I uncovered called the Notes on Fiction from 1929, he's really planning to get his revenge on journalistic criticism and what he called the cult of the ugly. But he's very self-aware. So he's seething at the kind of change in the literary market, but he's very much aware that he's writing for a different era. And so there was sort of a kind of important self-awareness that crops up in a number of the letters. And what I assume was meant to be a kind of a piece of literary criticism, the Notes for Fiction. I'm still trying to decipher his handwriting. I wasn't able to fully transcribe that particular document. From what I understand, he's in ill health in the late 1920s. He senses that the end is near. He starts to consider paying someone to publish his collection of stories. He reaches out to a publisher called the Stratford Company, which had offered to publish his stories for a fee in 1926. He shied away from doing so at the advice of some of his friends who said, if you pay to publish, it's going to undermine your literary credibility. And so he declines in 1926. In 1928, he returns to the Stratford Company, who ultimately do not publish his stories because he wasn't willing to cede editorial control over the stories. This was one of the other major obstacles to publication. Was he wasn't willing to have a modern editor put the modern touch on his precious Victorian stories. He's rejected by 5 other publishers from 26 to 27. He eventually reaches out once again to his friend George Dow at the Wayside Press in 1928. Right? Dow suggests that they would publish November Night Tales, and they would give the copies to Mercer to sell here in Doylestown. And I don't know how I was going to do this. I couldn't figure it out. That Dow also suggested that they could publish the book, but with a Doylestown imprint rather than a Topsfield, Massachusetts imprint. And that if they did so, they could publish 1,000 copies at the cost of $1,380. Once again, Dow wanted to have the stories pared down and edited, and Mercer was not willing to allow that to happen, and so he ultimately doesn't publish with Dow at the Wayside Press. Right. So eventually he finds the Walter Neal Publishing House in 1928. Walter Neal had been publishing since 1894. Most notably, he publishes the Life of Ambrose Bierce and the collected works of Ambrose Bierce. And anything you find about Neal or in any any materials that you find about Walter Neal Publishing put out by Walter Neal himself, you will find him mentioning Ambrose Bierce because he really makes a name for himself as a publisher, publishing the works of Ambrose Bierce. The Neal Publishing House published a lot of Southern writers writing about the South. It really leans sort of politically conservative. And notably, another sort of interesting, exciting fact that I stumbled across is Neal is one of the last people to have corresponded with, or that Bierce had corresponded with before his mysterious disappearance in Mexico. When I was writing this essay, in fact, Sotheby's had a letter from Bierce to Neal up for auction. It seems that he finds his way to Neal because through the literary agent Brant & Brant, he has his friend Joseph Sanford actually scout out this publisher ahead of time before deciding to go with Walter Neal. Sanford reports back that Neal is in financial trouble, that they have bad credit, and may be on the outs. The most salacious thing I found out about Walter Neal himself, as you can see from this little image from a New York Times article in 1912, he was jailed for threatening one of his own authors, who had made some sort of vague threats of fraud, or excuse me, vague accusations of fraud. As I understand it, Neil had threatened to write a kind of, as you can see there, a booklet, publish a booklet attacking this author and her book. And he finds himself in jail for this sort of retaliation on one of his own authors. It's not clear if she was upset about the sales numbers. Maybe she felt like he wasn't promoting the book as much as he could have. But he definitely seemed like a certain type of character, which is ironic because in the letter from Bierce, Bierce sort of praises Neil for his moral character, or at least suggests that he has a kind of high moral character, but his actions speak differently. When Neil's letters to Mercer are probably the most fascinating thing that I came across in the archive. He's extremely gushing about, or flattering about, Mercer's manuscript. He's extremely eager to publish it. He too compares Mercer with Conan Doyle, with Bierce, with Edgar Allan Poe. But you can tell that he's really eager to take on this particular collection. He even says here that the publication of the stories would be counted as a notable event, and I have not the least doubt, particularly as the time seems right for the public, the educated public, to turn back to standards of artistry, right? So he's really kind of speaking to that sensibility that he senses in Mercer's correspondence as well as in his stories themselves. And so ultimately, Mercer decides to go with Walter Neil in 1928. They agree on $1,500, which would be paid in 3 installments. They would publish 1,000 copies of Mercer's book. The sort of pre-publication advertisement for November Night Tales was an extensive description of the stories and of Mercer's sort of talent. And again, gushing, flattering, makes it sound like the best thing to come out since Poe, since Bierce, since Conan Doyle. At one point, he even says that some of Mercer's stories, Conan Doyle doesn't even come close to matching Mercer. Yeah.
The $1,500 were paid to Mercer, or Mercer paid?
He paid Neil the $1,500. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Yeah. One of the other interesting things that's revealed in the correspondence between Neil and Mercer, to the frustration of Neil, is that, well, I'll come back to that in a second. Mercer was very hands-on in the design of the book itself. This I found really, really interesting. He was very explicit about what color the dust jacket should be, what color the book itself should be, the quality of the paper, the typeface. There's the Sagittarius image on the front there. Mercer was very specific. It should be facing to the right, not to the left. And that you can see the curve of the neck on the Sagittarius figure. He had specific comments about how long the curve of the neck should be, which I found really fascinating. And from what I understand about Mercer, I'm no expert on the man. This is very much keeping in his character to have these kind of specifications. He even said very specifically, "I would like it to look like this book by Margaret Sherwood, Little Henry and His Bearer, published in 1830, right?" And you can see the outcome, or sort of, the product very much looks like that book on the left there. And so he had in mind a very specific text that would be the model of his own. Neil was also owner of something called the Scenario Supply Company, and suggested to Mercer, even before the book came out, that he might want to buy the rights to the film version of some of his stories, which, as far as I could tell, Mercer didn't go for, but there it is. Mercer receives a number of proofs or galley editions of the book before it's actually printed, which is, for anybody, if you don't know, it's like very late stage in the publishing process. And Mercer insisted on having editorial changes made on the galley proofs, which are extensive enough to really irritate Neil, because that meant going back, re-editing the stories, taking out, or I guess restoring some of the material that had been changed by Neil's editors, right? Incurring another $250 in editorial fees, which Mercer was happy to pay because he wanted his stories to appear as he wanted them to appear. They agreed to split the sales 50-50. The book sold for $2 per copy. Mercer would get $1. Neil would get $1. And I should say, when I visited the Mercer Museum in 2020, I follow Panoply Books in Lambertville on Instagram, and I saw that in the summer of 2020, they had a copy, pristine copy of Mercer's book here. I'm not a rare book collector, so I wasn't going to spend $500 on it. There are moments when I wish I had, because it is extremely rare, given that there are only 1,000 copies, especially with the dust jacket intact. I found out, I stopped into Panoply yesterday, among 3 other bookstores in the area, and I was speaking to the proprietor there in Rawland, and I asked him, I kind of want to know who bought this book, because it's so, and he said, well, I actually kept it. Right? So he has the book. He insists he's not a rare book collector, because when you're trying to sell books, buying the books you're trying to sell or keeping the books you're trying to sell is not a good policy. But anyway, he's got one of those copies. The book, as Mercer wrote to his friend Francis Lerman, fell flat on publication. It wasn't a success by any means, although Mercer was extremely pleased with the book itself. I think primarily, given what he says in the documents that I was consulting in the archive, he really loved the way that it looked. It looked exactly as he wanted it to look, and the stories appeared as he hoped they would appear. And so even though it fell flat, he was extremely pleased with the publication itself. Last thing here. He knew that his sensibility was passé. He knew that the Victorian sensibility had been superseded by a more modern, realistic sensibility in the literary world. But he held out hope that there would still be an audience for these stories, as he put it, that he, wrote at odd hours in his free time. He hoped that there would be an audience out there looking for a little bit of entertainment on a November evening. I think this quote from a letter from Mercer to his friend Owen Wister, who is an author of the Virginian and other Westerns, I think this really summarizes Mercer's judgment of, or sort of a assessment of the literary market at the time of publication. He says, "As to stories, I must have the last word if I retire, which is that Sinclair Lewis and Sherwood Anderson and the other up-to-daters have Chicagoized American fiction, and that Galsworthy had a horde of photographers and a horde of photographers are undermining the old charm and atmosphere of England as created by Dickens and the Victorian writers, ending with Hardy and sometimes Conrad." I think that quote kind of sums up where he was at in terms of his assessment of fiction at the time. Luckily, there's been a sort of renaissance of what is now referred to as weird fiction. And not only did Mercer's November Night Tales get reprinted once in 2015, or by one publisher, but by 2 publishers, and I think it took a while, not quite a century, but there's definitely an audience for his fiction now, and I do think he's maybe not Bierce or Poe. Maybe if he had a better editor, he might be Bierce or Poe. But his stories are definitely worth reading if you like genre fiction, or if you're interested in Mercer. They're very well crafted and definitely worth your time. So, yeah, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Yes.